You are listening to We Saw the Devil, an investigative and conversational true crime podcast that deep dives into fascinating criminal cases that are solved, unsolved, or ongoing. From America's Lori Vallow to Germany's Armin Meiwes, we examine and discuss the world's most shocking cases. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to follow us online. Check us out at WeSawTheDevil.com and We Saw the Devil on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And don't forget, you can become part of the show by backing us on Patreon. Hello everyone, you are listening to We Saw the Devil. This is Robin, and today's episode is about Netflix's new miniseries, Monster: The Jeffrey Dahmer Story. Full disclosure, I did in fact watch it. I binged it over just a couple days, and I really want to talk about this because I can't remember the last time a miniseries caused such an uproar. The dialogue surrounding it has been incredibly interesting to say the least, and it brings up a lot of great questions that have clouded the true crime genre for a very long time. One of those is the ethics of it all. So I'd really like to do a little bit of a dive and get your thoughts on it. Following that, I would also like to discuss another film that was released on Netflix this week, Blonde. I re-released the Marilyn Monroe 2-episode series that I did yesterday because I really want the facts out there. It felt right to repackage them and put them out as a singular episode, really to get the facts out there. And again, what's so fascinating to me, I guess, and something that I've really learned about myself is I had zero interest in Marilyn Monroe until last year. I think I'd maybe seen 1 or 2 films with her in it. I came across an article about CIA equipment being found. Everything was tapped in her home. Every single room was tapped. A couple purchased her home and then found a bunch of wiretapping equipment in the walls in every single room. I was completely fascinated by that for some reason. So I started to do a deep dive and just learned so much about this person. A little bit obsessed maybe. But the film Blonde came out this week, and I also want to talk about it because I find that it actually ties into the Jeffrey Dahmer story, because I'm hearing the same word thrown around in discussing both things, both pieces of media. And the word of the week is exploitation. It's exploitative. So before we get into it, let's just get some really quick housekeeping out of the way. You're listening to We Saw the Devil. I'm your host, Robin. You can find our website at WeSawTheDevil.com. From there, you can find us across all social media like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, our Patreon, and so forth. Also, if you're liking the show, please just take 10 seconds out of your day and leave that 5-star review. It tells the content creators that you're enjoying what they do, you want to hear more of it, and it really helps out a lot. Alrighty, let's just go ahead and get right into it. So, everyone knows that Netflix has kind of become your go-to hub for true crime content. From the documentary this podcast had some snippets in, Crime Scene: The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel, to Most Hated Man on the Internet, The Night Stalker, The Hunt for a Serial Killer, The Ripper, Worst Roommate Ever, The Trials of Gabriel Hernandez, and also the reboot of the creepy classic Unsolved Mysteries. Above all, lest we not forget Tiger King. There is absolutely no shortage of true crime content to sift through. And like most of you, I watch a lot of it too. In fact, probably most of it. But it doesn't just stop at Netflix. Switch over to the generic internet and you can likely find millions of hours of content on YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook. Full trials, police interrogations, short synopsis videos, dramatizations, full documentaries, true crime ASMR, true crime makeup tutorials. Change over to your phone and the sky's the limit with a seemingly unlimited number of true crime podcasts available at your disposal. When the podcast Serial launched back in 2014, it became the fastest podcast to reach 5 million downloads and streams on iTunes. It was the first in its entire history. And I mean, who among us didn't become fascinated with a certain case, then log into, say, like iTunes or Spotify, and then search for the name of that murder, of that case, only to listen to 12 different podcasts about the same case? Speaking for myself, I mean, hell, guilty as charged. And Ryan Murphy's newest dive into the darkest recesses of the human psyche, Monster: The Jeffrey Dahmer Story, is the latest addition to this. But it's not his first. He's previously brought us American Crime Story, the assassination of Gianni Versace, Impeachment, American Crime Story, and The People versus O.J. Simpson. And like I said earlier, full disclosure, I watched the Jeffrey Dahmer story. I actually binged it over like 2 days. And honestly, as a standalone miniseries, I absolutely loved it. I thought Evan Peters gave a performance of a lifetime. Biopics are super hit or miss to me, but as a general fan of both Ryan Murphy and American Horror Story, I wanted to give it the benefit of the doubt. For those listeners who may be new from other countries or not necessarily familiar with Jeffrey Dahmer, let's just briefly talk about who he is. Jeffrey Dahmer was one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. He murdered and dismembered 17 men, including 2 children, between 1978 and 1991. He's also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal because he's perhaps best known for cannibalizing some of his victims, as well as the acts of necrophilia he committed upon the corpses. Honestly, I absolutely despise recommending this, but Wikipedia actually has a really good write-up on the case as well as about the victims. What it's missing, though, is the full picture of the setting. The Dahmer case intersects with the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, which was a hugely pivotal cultural time in America in terms of the LGBTQ and BIPOC communities. And I've said BIPOC before, and some people reached out and they're like, hey, what does that mean? Just so you know, it means Black, Indigenous, and people of color. You also have to remember that gay men at that time who were victims of crime, in the 80s and early 90s, they rarely reported said crimes to police because they were fearful of being outed to their employers or even their families. Combine overall homophobia and racism, and Dahmer was actually targeting minority communities that were already at a major disadvantage. And as I posted on Instagram, systemic racism and injustice is actually what enabled Jeffrey Dahmer to kill for so long. Dahmer's victims were primarily Black or brown gay men. And the series does do a great job showing that police may or may not have been actually fully invested in the victims due to the color of their skin. And multiple examples of this are shown in the miniseries. There's one scene where one of the police officers jokes about needing to be, quote, deloused after leaving the apartment. This is actually real. After they sent Konarak back with Dahmer, they called into dispatch. They were sent to another scene, and they gave an update. And he said, quote, the intoxicated Asian naked male was returned to his sober boyfriend. And both he and his partner, Joseph Gabrish, were laughing through that update. 15 minutes later, Balcerzak and Gabrish are dispatched to another scene. And then Balcerzak cracks another joke and says, quote, 10-4, it'll be a minute. My partner's going to get deloused at the station. And that's an obvious crack at them being at a gay man's apartment. After Dahmer was arrested, that phrase, the deloused phrase, was recited over and over again by community activists. They blamed the police for their indifferent and negative attitudes about the gay community. They blamed them for allowing it to happen. Never mind the fact that they cared so little that they allowed this 14-year-old child, who, per the witnesses who were on the scene, very much looked like a small child, to go back to this grown adult and believe his word, this white man, and believe his word. One thing that the show added for dramatic effect was the 2 officers, John A. Balcerzak and Joseph T. Gabrish. The show states that they won Officer of the Year. That did not happen. In reality, they were actually both suspended due to the backlash from the community. However, they then filed a lawsuit against the city of Milwaukee and ended up winning, thus being reinstated. And I'm seeing a lot of people tweeting or putting it on Facebook in different groups or on Instagram and TikTok and talking about how they were nominated as Officers of the Year. And that just did not happen. That is not fact. Also in the show, the threatening phone calls that police officers made to the family of Dahmer victim Konarak Synthasimphone. Yeah, those were actually real. They really did harass them. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel confirmed with the Milwaukee Police Chief, Philip Areola, that several cops did in fact prank call that Laotian family while they were looking for their missing son, their missing 14-year-old child. The police called this family while they were searching for their child and made violent and racial threats. And that's before they realized that Dahmer had murdered him. Here, enter Glenda Cleveland. In real life, Glenda Cleveland had never seen, met, or even really knew of Jeffrey Dahmer until the night of Konarak's murder and the incident with police. Glenda's daughter was actually on the street and watched all of this happen, told her mom about it, and Glenda felt like something wasn't right. But in the show, Glenda is depicted as Jeffrey's immediate next-door neighbor in the Oxford Apartments building. This is an extreme creative liberty taken on behalf of the show to further the story. And Glenda's character includes recollections from many of Jeffrey Dahmer's actual neighbors. The smell, the noises, his creepiness. The real Glenda Cleveland actually lived in an adjacent building. She called the police after her daughter told her about the incident involving a drugged and drunk 14-year-old Konarak and the police handing him back over to Dahmer. Again, Glenda would not stop calling the police. She said she had a really bad feeling. And when they wouldn't help, she turned to the FBI. But they said that it was outside of their jurisdiction and they declined to get involved. In fact, it would take 7 more weeks for Jeffrey Dahmer to be arrested after that incident. 5 of Dahmer's 17 murders, including Konarak, came after Glenda Cleveland tried to alert police. I mean, really, you guys get the point, right? The list of differences between reality and the series can go on for hours. Scene by scene, the show takes creative liberty, and that can be okay sometimes. This particular 10-part miniseries was created, filmed, and produced with almost zero announcement at all. I didn't even know that this was going to be a thing until a couple weeks before it was released. It was done secretively and, most importantly, without any consultation or approval from the family members of the victims, much less anyone else involved, from law enforcement, neighbors, prison officials, anyone. Evan Peters, who plays Jeffrey Dahmer, the star, quote-unquote, gag me of this miniseries, posted a promotional video to his Twitter immediately leading up to its release. And he said, quote, "You need to have certain plot points because he did do these things, but you don't need to embellish them. We get it. We don't need to see it over and over again. It's important to be respectful to the victims' families." Okay, record scratch. Let's stop the bus right here. He said, quote, "respectful to the victims' families." Think about that for a moment. Imagine your loved one was killed by one of the most sensationalized serial killers in history. They disappeared for months or years. Then it was discovered that they were killed in a horrific manner and possibly cannibalized. Can you fathom the layers of grief and anger that you would experience just from hearing that? It then takes years for the press and interest in this case to die down, except it never really goes away. There's countless documentaries and TV shows made about your loved one's killer every single year. His face is printed on t-shirts, on merchandise. There's a tourist walk around the city that he was based out of where you can tour different places that he went. White women with true crime podcasts, irony not lost, cover him on a weekly basis. Then suddenly Netflix, one of the largest entertainment platforms in the world, pops up like, surprise! Here's a 10-part miniseries showing in graphic detail how this monster slaughtered all of his victims, including your loved one. By the way, we may not have consulted you or even let you know, but hey, enjoy watching yourself be played on screen by this actor that we got. And all you're left to do is watch from the sidelines, shocked, while countless media requests start pouring in to ask you questions about a show you've never even been asked about, much less received an offer to get paid for. I cannot even fathom it. And going one step further, I heard this analogy, and this was just kind of like what made it click to me, is imagine that your 6-year-old child was murdered in Sandy Hook. And Adam Lanza became a cult-like figure where you have to endure constant documentaries, miniseries, movies, news headlines, and so forth. Then Netflix decides to recreate the incident on film 30 years later. It doesn't even bother to include you, notify you, nothing. How would you feel? You're sitting helplessly by as you watch the commodification of your deceased child's memory. And that's quite literally what's happening here. And I'm the last person to act like the morality or ethics police when it comes to true crime media. Please believe me. I want to make that point very, very, very clear. I watched this miniseries with every bit as much a feeling of morbid fascination as the next person. And I'm not trying or intending to shame anyone for watching any of it. As the host of a true crime podcast, I've often wondered myself whether covering cases, and the ones particularly that I do, is exploitative to the victims and their families. And honestly, that's why I basically stopped covering the Lori Vallow case as a whole and moved on to other cases and stories. I felt like the content on this podcast was damn near as sensationalist as court TV when it came to the Vallow case. And I basically woke up one day and felt completely disgusted with myself. There's a fine line between reporting the facts of a very intricate and complex case like the Lori Vallow case and Chad Daybell case, but then also borderline exploitation because of the sensationalism of it all. And y'all, I know that most of us are in some sort of true crime group or forum and see people just go up to the diving board and jump off into crazy conspiracy theories, and sometimes they go real life and reach out to the family members. And that's what's so fascinating about where we are in history now in terms of like true crime media, because true crime media has been around, God, since like the Middle Ages. Even Jack the Ripper, people would sell drawings and little like comics and drawings about the murder. This is not a new concept in humanity's history. Morbid fascination has always been there. But what has not always been there is the internet. The free and constantly available consumption of endless TV shows or forums where victims and victims' families can interact with people who are following these cases so closely. I feel like there's a very fine line between facts, entertainment, and exploitation, especially when it comes to the victims. Take the case of Betsy Faria, who was murdered by her best friend, Pam Hupp. I did a 5-episode series on that case. I interviewed Russ Faria's attorney, Joel Schwartz, who, after Russ Faria was sentenced to life in prison, Joel Schwartz, was his attorney, came up and said, nope, got the appeal, and Russ Faria was in fact wrongly convicted. It was Pam Hupp who murdered his wife. And you can still listen to those episodes. They're still up there. I did endless hours of research to make sure that I got all my facts straight and reported just the facts. And then the NBC show, The Thing About Pam, came out. And I do my due diligence with every single episode that I put out, that every single thing I say is factual and has been at least verified by 2 to 3 other sources. I do my absolute due diligence with that. And then the NBC show, The Thing About Pam, came out. And I think most of us were expecting something very, 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 very different than what NBC actually offered us. A couple months ago, Betsy Faria's daughter made a video on TikTok and then also did an interview. She said that she's constantly asked if she's getting paid for the TV show since her name is used on it. And she's not. In fact, she couldn't even finish the first episode because she was so appalled by the black comedy vibe to the whole thing. Renee Zellweger played Pam Hupp and she was wearing a fat suit, and it just became kind of like this comedic thing. It was super gross. And Betsy Faria's daughter said, this is a show built around her mother's murder. And she said for people to watch it and get satisfaction, it's just kind of strange. And Janet Meyer, Betsy Faria's mother, reported in an interview with Fox 2 that the show was incredibly hurtful to her. The night of Betsy's murder, she went to her mother's house for dinner. She did that all the time. Pam Hupp picked her up, took Betsy home, and then ended up murdering her in her living room. Well, in the show, it showed an emotional final goodbye between Betsy and her mom. And that never happened. It was just another normal day. There wasn't some dramatic, long final goodbye between Betsy and her mother. That never happened. And she said that it was emotionally devastating to see that piece added in there. And like Janet's granddaughter, no one's contacted her either. And that also extends to podcasters. Betsy Faria's daughter said, you know what, it's not even just this show. I'm seeing a bunch of podcasts surface about my mom, and not a single one of them has reached out to me to see if I want my mom's story to be told or even to get facts from me. And considering I myself spent considerable amount of time, like 20 hours on the Pam Hupp case, telling that story. I spent a considerable amount of time on this case, and not once did I reach out to Betsy Faria's daughter. It's no wonder that she's feeling exploited when all of these new avenues are coming out and taking her family's story and reciting it, some faithfully, some not, for mass consumption. Rita Isbell penned an essay in response to the new Dahmer miniseries. And if you guys recall, her brother was 19-year-old Dahmer victim Errol Lindsay. Rita gave an explosive victim impact statement in court. And she was overcome with anger and emotion, and she actually tried to attack Dahmer. Netflix recreated that courtroom scene frame by frame, word for word. And before I knew that Netflix hadn't contacted anyone related to a victim even, I shared that. Someone made a side-by-side video showing the real Rita Isbell on one side, and then also the actress who plays her in the movie. I'm talking same everything, right? And in terms of recreation and recreating that, I got teary-eyed. It was impactful. I was like, wow, this actress is incredible. I mean, they really recreated all of it. Not knowing that Netflix hadn't reached out to anyone. But then after I found out they didn't, it was just absolutely disgusting. So in her essay, Rita wrote, quote, "When I saw some of the show, it bothered me, especially when I saw myself. When I saw my name come across the screen and this lady saying verbatim exactly what I said. If I didn't know any better, I would have thought it was me. Her hair was like mine. She had on the same clothes. That's why it felt like reliving it all over again. It brought back all the emotions I was feeling back then. I was never contacted about the show. I feel like Netflix should have asked if we mind or how we felt about making it. They didn't ask me anything. They just did it. But I'm not money hungry, and that's what this show is about. Netflix trying to get paid. I could even understand it if they gave some of the money to the victims' children, not necessarily their families. I mean, I'm old. I'm very, very comfortable. But the victims have children and grandchildren. If the show benefited them in some way, it wouldn't feel so harsh and careless. It's sad that they're just making money off of this tragedy. That's just greed. The episode with me was the only part I saw. I didn't watch the whole show. I don't need to watch it. I lived it. I know exactly what happened." And there's another person in this case who knows exactly what happened as well. And his name is Tracy Edwards. Tracy Edwards is the episode 1 of the series, and he's the would-be victim who ultimately escaped and then brought the police to Dahmer's apartment, forcing his arrest and the discovery of his crimes. Did you know that Mr. Edwards suffered from severe PTSD that put him in and out of mental hospitals and prisons for years? He eventually became chronically homeless and then drug addicted. He was indicted for sexual battery involving a 14-year-old girl and then extradited to face charges in Mississippi. He's been accused of property damage, drugs, theft, ignoring bail. He's been homeless roughly since 2002, and he was arrested for some kind of role involving like a fellow homeless man who was thrown off of a bridge. He apparently got blamed for having a hand in that. So back in 2011, he was sentenced to 1.5 years in jail and 2 years of extended supervision. No one knows where he is or what happened to him. When he came across the path of Jeffrey Dahmer, he was well-spoken, put together, barely even drank that much, and then he almost died. He was interviewed quite a bit. He went on many national news networks and talked about his experience. He was suffering from extreme PTSD. He received absolutely zero resources. Even though he almost died at the hands of one of America's most notorious criminals, he received zero resources and zero assistance. And there will be no shortage of true crime podcasts coming out that are rehashing the Jeffrey Dahmer murders. I've already seen them posted and advertised around Twitter. Guys, I must be getting old and I must be getting really lame. Or maybe I'm just having a better understanding of myself, but I'm in a lot of what you call shitposting groups on Facebook of just memes, right? Just meme groups where people post memes. Sometimes they're super offensive. Sometimes they're just funny. All of a sudden this week, it's been all Jeffrey Dahmer memes all the time. Whereas 15, 16-year-old me would probably have laughed at, how edgy that appeared. I just find it incredibly distasteful now. Now that I know better, and now that I know that there are actual real life human beings behind all of this, it makes me just really kind of sad. And any analysis or discussion of the genre of true crime would be short-sighted if I didn't mention its demographics. The listener base of true crime as a whole, podcasts particularly, skews roughly 75% female, 25% male. My audience is more like 80% female and 20% male. Sorry, I love you guys. We got some analytics. But this has been discussed at length. This is something that is consistently discussed. If you actually start to Google the phrase, why do women? Like true crime is an autofill suggestion on Google. Why do women? Like true crime is one of the many autofill options. There is a psychological pull here for many women. Even though men, by the numbers, are more likely to get murdered, women are far more fascinated with it via true crime media. In a previous episode, I discussed, my personal beliefs of why I believe that to be the case. I believe that we as women share a foundational human experience. If you recall that episode, I believe it starts from the time that we're children. Stranger danger. Then don't drink too much. Watch how you carry your purse. Don't park in dark parking lots. Don't take your eyes off your alcoholic drink while you're in the bar. Look behind you to see if anyone's following you. I mean, the list goes on and on in terms of kind of like a mental checklist of hoops that women have to go through in order to be quote unquote safe and careful. We are basically programmed from a young age to be more vigilant and more careful than men. So psychologically, it makes sense that true crime can be a somewhat cathartic experience for us. We feel like we're learning something while also feeling, safe and in control. Because the horrible experience that we're listening to on a true crime podcast, it's not happening to us. We're listening to it. And on the topic of film, we're now approaching my absolute favorite part of the year. I am so excited about all of the things coming out over the next month. I'm a huge horror fan. Rob Zombie's The Munsters dropped this week, and it's positively adorable. Hellraiser is coming in 2 days now, and a whole host of horror movies are coming out this month. But most importantly, Blonde, the Marilyn Monroe biopic, and I use that word very, 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 very loosely because it's actually not a biopic, based on the Joyce Carol Oates book, dropped on Wednesday. And I've been obsessed with it since I first heard that it was in development. It was supposed to be the main Oscar contender for the year, and the hype train has been unreal for that. But then on Wednesday, it was released to the wider public. Clocking in at 2 hours and 47 minutes, it's definitely not a fast or quick watch. But it didn't take long for the internet to be completely consumed by outrage. Many of you have listened to the series that I released on Marilyn Monroe. I just packaged those episodes together and re-released them as a single one yesterday. I became fascinated by Marilyn Monroe for the same reason that I'm obsessed with mid-century everything. And probably, honestly, the same reason that most of us are actually interested in true crime to begin with. And that's the dichotomy between something bright, beautiful, and shiny, and then the rot and decay that's actually hiding beneath it. I watched Blonde within minutes of its release. And guys, first off, I'm begging you, please do not read or believe the reviews. If you have even a slight interest in Monroe, I implore you to watch it. Not only is this film a technical masterpiece, the aspect ratio changes, the sets, the photography, the acting is the most phenomenal I've ever seen. Ana de Armas, she is Marilyn Monroe. She became the best living actress in my book. Like Meryl Streep, who her portrayal of Marilyn Monroe, it was just absolutely stunning. And again, I watched the film quite literally minutes after it was released. So I didn't see any of the reviews. I went in pretty much immediately. I had tears in my eyes through about a third of the film and came away from it with a feeling of elation. I found it breathtakingly beautiful in the technical sense, all of it to reflect mood and mental state. I truly personally believe that this film is a masterpiece. The only regret that I actually have is that I won't be able to experience it for the first time again. But then the reviews started pouring in, like right as I was watching it and as I was finishing it. And it's a backlash that's rivaled even the Jeffrey Dahmer miniseries. 1 and 2.5 star ratings across the board. Planned Parenthood immediately released a statement saying that it's pro-life propaganda. Feminist websites are calling it torture porn. And these are women that I tend to read articles by and really typically agree with. The New York Times released one of the most scathing reviews. The critic said, Andrew Dominic is so far up Marilyn Monroe's vagina in Blonde that he can't see the rest of her. One review quite literally said it's the Passion of the Christ for Marilyn Monroe, meaning that it's an endurance test of just watching her pain played out for the viewer. Exploitation. And there's that word again. Exploitation. I'm seeing just as many reviews call Blonde exploitative as reviews of Netflix's Dahmer. Yet for whatever reason, the label of exploitation does not sit right with me when applied to Blonde. Not even close. Do I find Dahmer exploitative? Yes, incredibly so. Do I think it should have been made? Absolutely not. Did I watch it anyway? Sure did. Am I probably going to watch more true crime miniseries and whatnot in the future? You betcha. But I don't find Blonde to be in the same vein. Dahmer was a serial killer. Marilyn Monroe, in her own right, was also a victim. And guys, this is definitely not the hot take right now, but this is how I feel, so you're just going to get my honest thoughts here. I found Blonde to be one of the most feminist films I've seen in years. I know some of you aren't really into that and hate the F word. I know others have seen the film and completely disagree with me entirely. Others may be opting out of watching it as a whole because of the reviews, and others may agree with me. I'm aware that it's not going to be the popular opinion with many people at all. But I find Blonde to be one of the most transgressively feminist and female-empowered films I've seen. I absolutely loved this movie, and I truly feel like everyone getting upset over it is missing the entire point. And I know this sounds absolutely batshit to say because it's quite literally a film that shows hardline abuse being committed upon Marilyn Monroe, whether it was real or creatively imagined. Don't forget, it's based upon the book by Joyce Carol Oates. It's a horror story about society above anything, and not just a straight line, happy biopic. Marilyn Monroe was many things, as I've talked about previously. She was a political activist. She was anti-segregation, anti-racism. One of her best friends was Ella Fitzgerald, and she worked hard to further Ella's career when Ella was being held back by segregation. She was pro-LGBTQ in a time where that was just absolutely unheard of. It was career-ending, even associating with someone who was openly gay. She started her own production company. She was well-read, had a brilliant mind, an amazing sense of humor. She campaigned for women to make more money in the studios and face less harassment by industry executives. Seriously, in the 50s, she did all of these things. And Blonde doesn't show them. And Blonde isn't saying that she didn't do any of them. It isn't saying that she wasn't a fully fleshed out, amazing person. It's saying that the reason why no one remembers her for them is because the patriarchy quite literally victimized her in every sense of the word. Her image, her intellect, and her body. And for those of you who think the term patriarchy is, man-hating bullshit, I beg you to hear me out just for a moment. We're going to, focus just on the 1950s. Mid-century, my favorite. Think of Mad Men, the TV show. Men controlled everything. Sexual harassment in the workplace was rampant. Men could beat their wives with zero legal repercussions. Women couldn't have checking accounts or credit cards. Most of them stayed at home and didn't have jobs. And if you recall from my Maryland episode, almost half of the female population above 18 was zonked out on some sort of opiate, either for exhaustion, anxiety, or depression. By the 60s, it was half of both male and female population. Men had the power, and I don't think a single listener here can disagree with that. Norma Jean Baker, aka Marilyn Monroe, she became an icon, the ultimate vision of beauty. When I was growing up, it was almost like always the girls who loved the movie Clueless for whatever reason. They all idolized Marilyn. Most of them had her poster on their bedroom walls or in their lockers. Do you guys remember Anna Nicole Smith? Her entire image was based on Marilyn Monroe. Playboy magazine, Marilyn Monroe. She was soft-spoken, submissive, and was especially loved by men. And whereas, yes, she was an amazing person with talent and intellect and heaps of self-awareness, Blonde is the story of how men took advantage of Marilyn's vulnerabilities by forcing her into this little box and then controlled and profited off of her image, all while simultaneously downplaying her intellect and talent. I'm even reading inaccurate facts in big publication reviews like the ones from the New York Times. They went off the rails about how it shows Joe DiMaggio beating her numerous times and then claims that there's no proof of that happening, that it's therefore more, here's the word again, exploitation. As I've discussed in previous episodes, almost every Marilyn biographer, as well as the studio makeup artists, came forward after her death and stated that they had a hard time, the makeup artists, keeping up with the bruises because Joe DiMaggio used to beat Marilyn Monroe almost bloody on a weekly basis while they were married. The scene in the film where Joe DiMaggio beats her after she does the infamous subway grate scene with her skirt when it flies up, that was real. Marilyn Monroe actually went into the hospital briefly to get checked for facial injuries. Then her marriage to playwright Arthur Miller, who's portrayed in Blonde by Adrian Brody, one of my all-time favorite actors. You know, Marilyn Monroe divorced Arthur Miller when she discovered that he was telling literally all of their friends and all of his contemporaries that she was pathetically stupid. He basically married her for arm candy, didn't care about her intellect and that she'd read everything. She was known for always being halfway through a book. He wanted the arm candy. He wanted the status. He did not want a woman that equaled or challenged him. The film shows this part of her life, albeit some of it is reimagined or fleshed out. Overall, I think the Me Too movement quite literally made this film possible and never would have been made even 10 or 15 years ago. You're showing Hollywood in that light, the Harvey Weinsteins, as it were. And I sincerely hope that this film gets people who watch it to read about how much good she did do in the world, how brilliant she was. Because the system, while she was alive, wouldn't allow it. Is it brutal? Yes. Is it painful to watch, especially as a woman? Absolutely yes, because it's meant to be. You know, the beautiful photos that we see of Marilyn Monroe, go to Michael's Arts and Crafts store and they have a Marilyn Monroe, that classic photo of her on posters. They used to sell them at Walmart, Target. You find them everywhere. Society chewed her up and spit her out, and yet we put her picture on our walls and want to remember her as this beauty, almost with no sense of agency. For the most part, that's how people view her, as just an icon, nothing more. And for the first time, cinematically at least, here's the uncensored look at the trauma behind one of history's biggest stars. In reality, she was raped by multiple studio executives. She had multiple abortions, multiple miscarriages, sexually harassed by countless others. One rape is shown just 15 minutes into the film, and it's the cause of a lot of this controversy and backlash. I'm going to speak to that in a moment, but I'd like to point out the fact that in the 1950s, a young fledgling actress who had nothing to lose, she had little recourse for reporting such a crime. Who would she have reported it to back then? She would have been blacklisted and never seen Hollywood again. And so Norma Jean Baker, what she did like so many other women did at the time. She just kept going. And it's my opinion that a lot of female backlash to Blonde is partially due to a visceral reaction based on like a built-in trauma response. 1 out of every 3 women experiences sexual violence at some point in their life, whether assault or harassment. 1 in every 4 women experiences domestic violence in their lifetime. The medium of film is such an intimate one, and a single scene can uplift, devastate, or both. Relating this to what actual academic studies have identified as the reason why women primarily are the consumers behind true crime media and podcasts, including podcasts, it's twofold. 1, I'm in control because I'm not the one being attacked. And 2, I'm learning tips and techniques of what I could do if I ever were to find myself in this situation. When it comes to Blonde, it's literally taking a pop culture icon and showing her power being taken away. And when you watch that, you are also watching your power being taken away, especially because we've kind of personalized and propped her up on a pedestal. We don't want to watch her degradation and abuse because it's tearing down and detracting from this perfect image that's been built. And we're now living in the post-Me Too era, so we don't get the payoff of learning what we can do differently. Because times have changed now. We can do differently, for the most part. Back then, you couldn't. There's no catharsis here. My personal, final closing thought is that you must understand that this is not a happy, exact historical biopic that's covering Marilyn with some sort of rose-colored lens. At times, it's difficult to differentiate between fact and fiction because it is in fact a mixture of both, just like the book. But I find the fact that this film confronts a lot of, known and documented history head on, and occasionally in graphic fashion, I find it to be empowering. To me, it's far more obscene to pretend that none of these largely true events happened to her, rather than show them and have society, the very society that accepted it, confront it. And I think that we all should confront it. Many of you may have seen I reached out to social media because I want to know ultimately what you guys think. Do you think the new Dahmer series on Netflix is exploitative and never should have been made? Do you think Blonde exploits the legacy of Marilyn Monroe or that it's too graphic? Or do you think they're absolutely fine and solid pieces of entertainment? I wanted to throw this back out to you guys to see what you think. Herminia said, as far as Dahmer, yes. Netflix's own description says it's largely from the victim's point of view. But without permission or interviewing families or the surviving victims, how can that be so? It definitely exploited the victims and their families without any permission with hopes of making the most money. Another one by Kathleen said, the families of Dahmer's victims have spoken out as they feel exploited. That is all I need to know. And a friend of color on here calls it black trauma porn. As a white person who never thought about that phenomenon, I've begun to reflect on how much of our entertainment is just that. I will be more reflective in my choices in the future. Angel wrote, they both exploit tragedy to entertain people. As an avid true crime consumer and a journalist, I know there's value in sharing these stories. I don't think the vast majority of people want anything from them other than entertainment and even a sense of security. Quote, this could never happen to me because I know what to look for. Or, at least my life isn't this screwed up. The question is, where do we draw the line? Marilyn Monroe was a public figure, so it's easy to argue that she asked for the spotlight in life and death. But when someone is forced into the public light due to no fault of their own, how do we tell the story while staying respectful? I guess you could argue that as long as court records are public, we're all just one serial killer away from being a public figure. Robbie said, I hate that her portrayal of Marilyn, which was honestly fabulous, will be overshadowed by the way the story was told. And finally, Christy said, I really am against the Dahmer one, simply because the victims' families have said they are very upset by it. For me, their feelings need to come first because Marilyn was a public figure, but Dahmer and the victims were not until he did what he did. So I want to know what you guys think. What do you think about Blonde and what do you think about Dahmer? Have you watched either? Do you have any immediate thoughts there? Very, very curious to know. I haven't seen backlash surrounding films and I can't even remember how long, but I find that it's a very, 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 very important conversation that a lot of people need to have in the true crime community, myself included. I've been having one hell of an internal dialogue for about a week now about all of this. So that's it for today, guys. Again, thank you for listening. As always, our website is wesawthedevil.com. From there, you can find us across all social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, as well as our Patreon. And like I said, I want to know what you guys think. If you absolutely hate my opinion and think I'm completely wrong, I want to know. I love interacting with you guys and talking and discussing and debating. So my email is info@wesawthedevil.com. Until next crime.